Welcome to my fifth video in my series on using Neenah, and we're going to start looking at the advanced sequencer. So I'm going to bring up Neenah, and when it's loaded I'm going to check that I'm using the very latest version. So when it loads, I'm going to load our previously saved profile called YouTube, and in the Options General tab I'm going to make sure that I'm using the latest build. So here I've got three sources for the build. I've got releases, the betas and the nightlies. Now the betas are intermediate levels of program which have had quite thorough testing. The nightlies are the ones where you get once every couple of days with a new version, and that's the one I'm going to choose. And you notice at the top here it says new update is available. So I'm going to click on that, download it, and I'm going to install the program in a few seconds. So I'm now going to hit update, and it will close Neenah down and update the version. And I'll come back in a few seconds when that's done. When you install a new version, it does not remove the configuration files or any of your document files, so it is literally just an update of the program itself and adds the new features. So again, I'm going to load my profile and we're going to take a look at our sequences. So I'm going to load a target as we did before, and we're going to take a look at that in the sequencer tab, and this is going to be the initial gateway into the advanced sequencer. Now there are several ways of creating an advanced sequence, and in fact behind the scenes they're all running using the same interface. It's just what is presented to the user. And I thought it might be interesting to see how the simple sequence that we created earlier is translated into the advanced sequencer format. And this can be done with this button down here. Clicking it is a one-way street, and it creates in the sequencer window still what the sequence looks like in the new advanced sequencer. And it'll just take us a little while to get ourselves acclimatized to the new environment. To the new user, this screen looks pretty intimidating, but it's not as bad as it seems, and it just needs a little bit of familiarity. On the right hand side we have three main buttons. We have templates, targets and instructions, and these are a source of what it says, targets, instructions and targets, that we can drag onto the window and create changes to our sequence. On the sequencer itself in the middle here you can see that there are a lot of lines and there's a scroll bar down the side. And part of that complexity is just simply the number of lines. So it sometimes helps just to collapse some of these icons just to simplify what we're seeing. And that allows us to see a better overall structure of what it's trying to do. So at the moment it's got a target, it's doing some preparation, it's doing the target imaging, and then it's got some closure instructions, and then there's some final instructions down the bottom here. And remember that what's on screen is exactly the same as in the simple sequence we had earlier, but this is just translated into the format where you can edit it to a much larger degree and add further controls to make it work in just the manner you want it to. So let's just take a more detailed look at what we have on screen. A sequence starts from the top of the screen and works its way to the bottom. And if we look at what we have here, we've got a number of recognizable actions that we set in the simple sequence. We've got meridian flips, we've got cooling the camera and unparking the scope. We then have the target M31, and if we expand it out a little bit, you see that we have the familiar coordinates, rotation and the little altitude graph that we've seen before. So let's just hide that and simplify what we have left. If you look carefully, you can see that these three groups of instructions are slightly indented from the target, and that's because it belongs to the target group, and if I collapse that, it disappears. So these are associated with this target. If we open them up, we can see and recognize familiar controls that we set in the simple sequence, including changing the filter to the red at the beginning, slewing and centering, starting the guiding and running the autofocus. and that's in the target preparation instructions. Under the next one, the target imaging instructions, this is where the physical exposures occur. We note that it says we want to do autofocus after a filter change and a temperature change, which is what we set in the earlier simple sequence, and then we have the exposures themselves, and that's for the red, green and blue filters, 20 lots of exposures of 120 seconds, light frames, 1x1 binning, and so on. If we collapse that and then look at this last one, the target closure instructions, at the end of the exposures it stops guiding. And then finally at the bottom there's another set of instructions that, as the name here implies, are run in parallel. The camera is warmed at the same time that the scope is parked. So now's the time to look at how this data is presented on the screen so we can understand how it works and also modify and create more sophisticated sequences. Before we start editing a sequence, let's just understand some of the icons and controls that are on the screen at the moment. So for instance, these little packages here are sequential instruction sets which are indicated by the 3 dots in a line, and it executes a sequence of instructions one after the other. The one at the bottom here is a parallel instruction set, and it executes instructions in parallel, and the whole thing concludes when the last one finishes. On each of these lines you'll notice a series of icons, and they can be associated with a top level set of instructions at the top here, or a sub-level one. But they do the same thing. You can, for instance, bin it and just get rid of it entirely. You can also duplicate it. You can change the running order by using the up and down buttons. And if it's a high-level one, you can save it. So for instance, all of these have a save icon, and this allows you to save this group of instructions and conditions as a template and use it later on another night. The other things on here is a little recycle button, so when the sequence is running and some of these things have been completed, little check marks appear against each one, and sometimes you want to go back and repeat, and you can reset it, and you can reset it at a simple level down here, or you can even reset it right at the top. The little bin icons here on each of these allow you to delete a single instruction or line, and equally the little plus buttons here allow you to add a new instruction, loop condition or a trigger. So when you hit these buttons, a drop down menu appears and you select what you wish. There's not that many triggers, the loop conditions are a little bit more, and there are a great deal many instructions. In fact, there's so many that they're grouped into categories, either the device type or maybe utility types like time related. There's other ways of adding items to this screen, and that is by simply dragging an item from the right hand side onto your system. So you can drag and insert, disconnect all equipment at this point, and that's exactly what it will do. So let's just delete that for the moment. These 3 little dots at the end here show a sub-menu. Not all items have a sub-menu, but they typically allow device-specific things to occur. So for instance, if the slew doesn't correctly identify itself and get within the tolerance within one iteration, it will just carry on to the next instruction. But equally, I could make it do 3 attempts, and I've got a number of options. So I can either skip the current instruction set, abort, or skip to the end of sequence instructions, which might mean shutting the mount down, closing the roof, and so forth. When you start putting in a number of options there, when you now go back up and collapse that, you've got 3 there because it's recognizing it'll try it 3 times. These little red circles with an exclamation mark mean that the particular piece of equipment that this is associated with is not yet connected, and it comes up with a little warning message. Now, we've mentioned but haven't really discussed what triggers, loop conditions and instructions are, and that's a critical part of the advanced sequencer. So I'm going to just pause for a second, get a cup of tea, and be back with you in a few seconds. Now I'm suitably refreshed, let's take a look at how sequences are built up using the advanced sequencer. we already have an understanding of the sorts of things that we can do. But what I really need to do is just clear the screen so that we can look at this at a very simplified level. So an imaging sequence is made up of a number of different instructions, and the simplest is a sequential instruction set. If I drag one onto here, this creates the archetypal instruction set, and it consists of 3 types of elements: triggers, loop conditions, and instructions. So let's take these in reverse order, because I think that's probably the most sensible way of doing it. So if I wanted to add an instruction, and let's take a camera instruction to take an exposure, I can now say I want to take a 10-second exposure and just standard settings. If I wanted to repeat that 10 times, what I will do is change its loop conditions. So I add a loop condition, and I can loop for iterations. So for instance, I can say I want to loop 10 times. So now I have a loop that will run and repeat an exposure of 10 seconds. So you can see this is another way of generating an image sequence of similar exposures. This loop doesn't have to have one instruction, it can have many. So for instance, if I find the filter wheel, I can for instance put a switch filter before here and change it to loom, and I can then do another one under here and change it to red, and then I can do another camera instruction, take an exposure here and put in another 10 seconds. And so what happens now is, whereas before it just took an arbitrary 10-second exposure, it now switches the filter to luminance, takes 10-second exposure, flips it to red, takes another 10-second exposure. And all of a sudden our sequence is starting to take on a more sophisticated appearance. Now, it's not only possible to have multiple instructions, you can also have multiple loops, and they all run together, and they basically come out of the loop as soon as one of the conditions is not met. So for instance, under loop conditions, I might have loop until time. So I might put in a time, and I can either put in a physical time or a nice easy one, say nautical dawn. So what happens now is it'll loop 10 times doing all this stuff, and whenever either it gets to 10 iterations or it reaches nautical dawn, it will come out of this loop and go on to whatever's down here. So the thing about loop conditions is, if you have been a programmer in a previous life, there's an AND operator, a logic operator behind the scenes, which is saying if the loop conditions are less than 10 iterations and it's before nautical dawn, go round one more time. And those loop conditions can be very powerful. For instance, if you have a safety monitor, you can say loop while safe. And so you can be doing imaging, and as soon as it gets cloudy or wet, it will come out of the loop, and you can, for instance, put an instruction down here somewhere that says close the dome shutter. So if I roll this up, you've got a sequential instruction set that does all this stuff, and as soon as it's unsafe, it closes the dome. And this is a very powerful technique for constructing advanced sequences. The other thing you can do is give it a meaningful name. So all you have to do is highlight it and just say take loom LR exposures. Okay, and if you want to, you can save this as a template for later use, and I'll show you about templates later on. But this is a quick way of, once you've established a complicated series of loops and instructions, you can then recall them and create new sequences in a very short period of time. Most loop conditions are tested at the end of the instruction, which either might be switch filter or taking exposure or whatever. But some don't, and don't wait. For instance, loop while safe, as soon as the conditions become unsafe, it will stop the current instruction and move out of the loop. One other thing about the loops is that they can be nested. So for instance, you can create a loop within a loop. That sounds complicated, but we actually have seen one already, because when we converted the simple sequence into this type of sequence display, it actually had a nested loop. But we'll come on to those at a later stage. For now, we need to talk about triggers. Triggers are instructions that are only executed when certain conditions occur. And what they do is interrupt the current instructions here, go off and do something, and then it comes back and carries on from where it left off. And this, for instance, is a perfect example of where we want to autofocus after a filter change, or maybe autofocus after a temperature change. So for instance, at the end of each exposure, the trigger is checked, has the temperature changed by more than 5 degrees, and if it has, it does an autofocus, and then it will carry on in the loop. There are a great many triggers, loop conditions and instructions to select from, and the list is expanding with the use of plugins too. And one thing to note is that in the main sequencer area, there's also a sequence start area and a sequence end area. Now, in particular, the sequence end area is quite important, and you, for instance, would put down your closed dome, and in terms of your telescope, you might put your park telescope command. And the reason being is that if you want to shut a sequence down early, one of the options is to immediately jump to the end of sequence options, which are these down here. So that gives you control. For instance, if one of these exposures didn't work and the number of attempts, so for instance the camera refused to do downloading, if after a number of attempts it failed, you can now say skip to end of sequence instructions, and what will happen is if that fails to download, it will immediately jump to park scope and closed dome shutter, ignoring these loop conditions up here. This is probably a good time to bring this video to a close before it gets too long. And in the next one, we're going to construct an imaging sequence from scratch using the controls and give you some insights into how to make more advanced and complicated imaging sequences. Thanks for watching.